So I hate to ask you this because it's almost too sensitive, but it just happened, and so I can't not ask you. There was appears to be a second assassination attempt on Donald Trump in just a couple months. What do you make of this?
I don't know what to make of it. I mean, I think we're seeing an impact, at least partially. I mean, I don't know I just don't know enough about what's happened, and I've been reading some of the internet stuff about the connections that this man may or may not have had to the intelligence agencies, et cetera. But I don't know what to make of it. I do know that there's an antagonism and a violence in our society now that I feel is orchestrated. I feel that we're living in and you remember a couple of years ago when they had the Occupy Wall Street movement, and they were trying to frame this debate as the 99% against the 1%. And I feel like since then, we've all been turned against each other, where it's 50% against 50%. And when the king and queen go out on the balustrades of their castle, and they look out across their people and they're all fighting each other, they go back to the banquet hall and they pop champagne corks because they know nobody's coming over the wall against them. And
boy, is that true.
And I think, so many of I announced my campaign almost 18 months ago. And what I said at that point is I'm not going to feed into the vitriol or the anger or the name calling, the demonization of my opponents. I'm going to be civil to all of them. And I'm going to try to identify values that all of Americans have in common, rather than focusing on these smaller issues that are used, the kind of culture war issues that are used to keep us all at each other's throats. Because I've watched what's happening in this country, and there's all these systems that have been put in place to shift wealth and power upwards, to clamp down totalitarian controls on the rest of us. And they all kind of culminated during COVID, where we saw all of our 3.3 million businesses shut down with no due process, no just compensation. $4.3 trillion shifted from the American middle class to this new oligarchy of billionaires. We created during 500 days, 500 new billionaires were created. The 500 days of the lockdown. And the American middle class has essentially been obliterated in this country. And I think and all this money is being shifted up to BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and the other big financial houses and big pharma and big tech and big ag and big food that are strip mining the American public of wealth, sucking it upward, and leaving nothing below. And the way that they keep that system in place, that they keep us from doing anything about it, is to keep us all hating on each other. And
one of the things that I admire about you is that you have more children than I do, which is not that easy. You have a lot of children, and you have made your campaign about them, which used to be a pretty conventional thing. Politicians would run on children, help the children, save the children, the next generation. You're one of the very few people who still talks like that. Explain, if you would, because I think you're sincere when you talk about it, how children, your children, and other people's children, mine, have inspired you to stay in politics when you could have just gone away and gone back to LA?
How my kids inspired me to do that. Let me finish the thought that I think I left incomplete on that last question. I think the anger that we have at each other also turns into violence. And, when my uncle was running for president, when my uncle was president in 1963, there was a tremendous anger that was coming out of the civil rights movement and other things that he was doing, shutting down the war against Castro and the war against Russia. There was tremendous anger and poison. When he landed in Dallas on November 22nd, there was a full-page ad in the big newspaper in Dallas saying "Wanted Dead or Alive" and with a picture of my uncle on it. And there were posters all over the street that day. And there was, my uncle was clearly killed by the CIA, but there were. But there was also an anger that had been sown across the American landscapes at that time that I think contributed to this atmosphere of violence that led to his death, Martin Luther King's death, my father's death 5 years later, and all the other assassinations that we saw during the 1960s. So I just wanted to complete that thought.
Well, but that was over 60 years ago, and that institution, those files are still classified, as you well know, better than most, and those institutions remain intact. And except for one series of hearings in 1975, there's been no meaningful effort to reform them. And you sort of wonder, at what point do we learn the truth about everything federal agencies have done with our money in our name, and at what point are they reformed?
Yeah, I think it's really, there's an act called the JFK Assassination Papers Act that requires all those documents be released to the American public by 2018, all the documents pertaining to my uncle's death. And President Trump, when he ran the first time in 2016, promised to release them, and then he didn't, which always struck me as odd. And then President Biden ran promising to release them, and he didn't. I had the opportunity recently to ask President Trump directly why he did not release them. And he said that Mike Pompeo called him and said, please do not let me make me release these. It is going to be a calamity for our country. President Trump says if he's going to release them, and I believe that he will.
So can I ask, why would Mike Pompeo, who I don't think was even born or had just been born when your uncle was murdered, why would he have an interest in keeping those documents secret?
Well, clearly it's not to protect any individual, because virtually all the individuals who were directly involved in my uncle's death, and many are now dead, and many of those have, gave deathbed confessions or gave confessions of various kinds before they died. But I think the only supposition that is rational is that it's about protecting an institution. And I think, in the last tranche of documents that were released, and the New York Times even reported this, and the Times has been one of the major bulwarks against conspiracy theories that depart from the single shooter Lee Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy. They've been the big bulwark against that. So it's extraordinary that they finally reported that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset, and that the CIA went to great lengths to conceal that, not only from the Warren Commission, and as most of you probably know, Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, whom my uncle fired after the Bay of Pigs, and then come back into public life to get himself appointed to the Warren Commission. And he was really the only commissioner that was there for every meeting. He was the only one that was paying attention. All of the other ones, like Chief Justice Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He had a full-time job. The other ones were congressmen and senators, other well-known individuals who were fully occupied by their work. The only one for whom it was a full-time job was Alan Dulles. And his function was to make sure that any questions about the CIA involvement were quashed. And he concealed the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had been recruited into the agency in 1957 and 1958 and sent on a mission to Russia, which was a false defection mission, and then brought back to this country. And so the first, and many of us who've been studying the assassination knew this, but it has never been reported in the mainstream press. And after that last tranche of documents was released 5 years ago, the New York Times finally acknowledged that. And there may be other information related to that they don't want released, but I have no idea what it is.
So what does it take? I mean, you can't have a democracy in a system